All right, I'm looking forward to talking about the book of Ecclesiastes and sharing with you some of the things that I've learned. Some commentators disparage the book, but I'm coming to love it. And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are introductory matters before we get into the book itself. The first thing is the author calls himself Kohelet. This is a title that refers to his function and not to his personal identity. If Solomon used his own name, we might call to mind all of the biographical things that we have learned, or that generation of readers might know about the person of Solomon, and instead he wants to make sure that we're paying attention to the message. So he uses the term Kohelet, which means one who assembles people, or the convener, or even the shepherd. It's a role that Solomon will take on to deliver this kind of book, this kind of genre to his readers. So Solomon is not shedding his role as king, but he is taking on a distinctive role, perhaps as the instructor of humanity. See, this book is going to go beyond Israel. Wisdom goes international in its scope, and so Solomon takes on the role of instructor of humanity. This brings up an interesting question for me. How do you teach wisdom? Is it simply an academic discipline? Could we memorize X number of rules, X number of principles, and then feel like we know wisdom? Or does wisdom need to be taught in a distinctive way? And some commentators, I even perhaps did this when we went through the book of Proverbs, in which we took things topically and tried to bring all that Proverbs said about a certain topic in. Wisdom speaks a little bit differently. The reason I think that we have the book of Proverbs with its individual proverbs, we have the book of Job with an extended discourse on not just why people suffer, but a willingness to submit to the authority of God and the tenderness and love of God in the midst of incredible suffering. We have almost a drama sort of thing. Or you could look at the format of Lamentations or the love song that is the Song of Solomon. So when wisdom speaks, it uses a particular method in order to get its point across. And Solomon says that he chose delightful words, well-driven nails. In other words, he structured this book to drive home his point with extraordinary accuracy. So he argues consistently and well for his conclusion. It is not a cut and pasted book like some would have us believe, but Solomon is driving to a point, and each time he comes around to a different movement, he has a conclusion at the end of that that he wants to make sure his readers get. So pay attention when you read these books. If it's not the structure that you're used to, don't therefore say it's got to measure up to our own expectations. It may be something quite better, something more as Solomon deadlifts our ignorance and our foolishness and introduces us on the whole of what wisdom is. So, there are two great refrains that come to us in the book of Ecclesiastes. One is the phrase, under the sun, and then the other phrase is the gift of God. Under the sun means that area where vanity is, where meaningless is. We'll talk about that in a minute. And it should be understood as what this world offers apart from God. And then the other phrase, the great gift of God, or this is the gift of God, whatever it is that Solomon's talking about. Under God's benevolent hand, he gives the gift of enjoying precisely those things which are vanity in their own right. So let me explain this a little bit. Suppose that I choose to pursue wealth. It is going to be my singular focus throughout the course of my life. I will work very hard to produce wealth, and I will make it, and I will sit on my pile of money. And Ecclesiastes wants to teach us that that would be vain. Riches are vain. Work is vain. It is empty, it is meaningless because, well, death comes, and it's going to come to all of us. And so, under the sun, in this life, there's got to be something more, something else. The work that we do, the riches that we obtain, those things cannot bring us ultimate joy, ultimate satisfaction. So it doesn't matter if it's fame, if it's good looks, whatever it is meaningless apart from God. But once we come to terms with who God is and what he wants for our lives, once that happens, then we put God in his proper place, and then we look back at all of the things that we counted loss, all the things that were vanity, all the things that seemed to be meaningless in this life. And now when we see them handed back to us from the benevolence of God, then we become content. They are signs of his care. They are signs of his provision. And so these two phrases work together. And the idea is, under the sun, everything is vain apart from God. But the great gift of God is when we see God first, the things that we have in this life come to us as gifts from his hand. The phrase, of course, in the King James says, everything is vanity. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Now what you have is the attempt to translate the Hebrew word for a wisp, for a vapor, something that is so ephemeral it couldn't at all be described as permanent. And it's sitting in the superlative. In the Hebrew, they don't have the suffix est, so they will say the Holy of Holies when they want to say the most holy place is the inner court of the temple. Jesus is described as King of Kings and Lord of Lords because kings is one category, and the one who rules over them, the most excellent king, is the King of Kings, or the most excellent Lord is the Lord of Lords. When we come to the book, the Song of Solomon, it is called the Song of Songs, which is Solomon, which is translated, then you could say, Solomon's most excellent song. So, what does vanity of vanities mean? It means of all the meaningless, superficial stuff that is in this world, this is the vanity of vanities, right? It is the worst case. So it's the most meaningless vanity. So vanity doesn't mean, in our text, final and ultimate absurdity, because that would not take God ever into account, and that is not the kind of world in which we find ourselves, so the book would be wrong. But vanity of vanities means that life is inscrutable, it doesn't make sense, and it is all empty without reference to God. Only God gives meaning and purpose into our lives, and once we find him, that meaning and purpose overflows into all of the things that he has made. Without it, some have called vanity of vanities, they've used the word meaningless, they've used the word frustration, because life is inscrutable. We can't understand it apart from our reference with God. So, some people will come to the book and they'll make these kinds of interpretation errors. Some would say the reason that Ecclesiastes reads like it does is because it developed over a long period of time with many different contexts, many different authors, many different rewrites, and so of course it's going to conflict with different parts of itself. But the people who say that, I'm not sure they understand what wisdom is, because wisdom doesn't conflict when it says things like, don't answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be like him. And then in the next verse, it would say, answer a fool, or he will think he's wise in his own sight. You see, the idea is you can't win. You're between a rock and a hard place. It's not going to work. That's the meaning, and it doesn't conflict. So when you see different things happening in the book of Ecclesiastes, ask yourself, what is the teacher trying to say? So we don't want to make the error of thinking that this is a cut and paste book full of conflicts, full of errors. But we also don't want to take on the approach perhaps of the pietist who would say, you know what, I'm going to pick out the stuff that seems like I could build spiritual fruit from that. That I find would be encouraged. But man, this other stuff over here, I've just got to reject that. So I like this sort of threefold pattern that Doug Wilson gives us in his book, Joy at the End of the Tether. We don't want to be that liberal, we don't want to be that pietist, and we don't want to exalt the difficult passages and show that this book doesn't fit at all, because this book is a part of the canon. It will agree with every other book in Scripture, and we have to find how that is. So we can't exalt the difficult passages at the expense of the pervasive orthodoxy of the book. There are different genres in the book of Ecclesiastes, and it is, in large, a royal testimony. It is a personal testimony like is described in the book of Deuteronomy, where I am giving a story of the course of my life and what I've learned, and I'm preparing to tell it not just so that I can be remembered honestly, but so that the next generation might learn from my wisdom, might learn from my decision-making, might learn from my mistakes, but it is my testimony that is left for the next generation. Ecclesiastes also has a number of what seem to be separate proverbs. At that point, it reads a lot like the book of Proverbs. And Ecclesiastes also likes those better than contrasts. This is better than that, and so this matters. So that's a little bit of an introduction to the kinds of things that we'll see as we go through the book of Ecclesiastes. Here's what I meant by that royal personal testament. These are some of the characteristics of that testament. By the way, if you have time, it might be a fun exercise, a real spiritual stretcher, to try to write one of yourself on your own as a public testimony in the first person singular. This is the kind of thing that Joseph gave Pharaoh at the end of the book of Genesis when it says he leans upon his staff and begins to tell his story. So it's the story at the end of a long pilgrimage, which probably means the book of Ecclesiastes fits at life with that latter part of the time of Solomon, when somebody might put together this kind of public testimony. It is a testimony, as I've said, that has been given for future generations. I'm not rehearsing it because I like to be the center of attention. I'm rehearsing it because I want to show God's faithfulness, because I want to give glory to Him, because I want to shout His provision, like they talked about His provision of giving us the fruit in the land. That's the passage I was talking about earlier in Deuteronomy. So I want to tell those stories so that God can get the glory and the future generations might come to trust Him as well. I would do this testimony in the assembly of the people, so when we all get together, it would be a public testimony that I would share as we rejoice over the things that God has given His people. So do you see what we have in front of us? This is Solomon, in his wisdom, kicking out of our lives all the things that don't fit, so that we might be left with the one thing in our lives that is most meaningful, and that is God. And once we have Him, then Solomon can start bringing those other things back in and saying, see, these are gifts from God's hand. And now they have meaning and purpose because they are connected to Him. So that's a royal testament. So here's the outline that Doug Wilson gives us in the book that I mentioned. Number one, satisfaction cannot come from anything within the power or competence of man. God is sovereign over everything. God alone gives power to enjoy this parade of vanities. And then the fourth movement is obstacles, discouragements, and practical concerns. Each of these movements has a conclusion to it, which is right at the end of the section, and it looks something like that. The first movement, the conclusion is, everything is emptiness apart from God. The conclusion for the second movement is, we should accept our lot. The place we are as human beings is a gift of God. Remember that passage in Acts chapter 17 that talks about God has arranged the times and circumstances of our lives so that somehow we might feel our way toward Him. That's the idea here. Once we see God is sovereign over the course of our lives, then we can begin to look at the various parts of it. Number three, God alone gives power to enjoy this parade of vanities. That's Doug Wilson coming out, and the end of that one is eat, drink, and be joyful, because that attitude will carry us through the different issues of our lives. And if we see it all as a gift from God's hand, then that is eat, drink, and be joyful is exactly the prescription for our times. Number 4, obstacles, discouragements, and practical concerns. The conclusion to that, of course, comes in chapter 12, fear God and keep his commands. All right, so 4 movements, 4 conclusions, the outline of the book of Ecclesiastes. The basis for wisdom jumps back beyond Moses. It jumps back beyond the Mosaic covenant. It jumps back beyond Deuteronomy and Exodus. It goes all the way back to the way that we're made. Wisdom argues from that original setting in which God placed man, where God set the boundaries, and in the natural, in the moral worlds, those boundaries are set by God for our good. So in this sense, wisdom argues from natural law. It goes back to the way God made things, the way they have been created, and so that is the ground of wisdom. And the creation ordinances, law and life and marriage and work and rest, they are all built upon in the book of Ecclesiastes to explain where wisdom lies. So we look at the way God made things, and then we try to bring our lives into alignment with those things. So when the Garden of Eden tells us about the sanctity of law, and God is the only one who can say, thou shalt not, then wisdom recognizes in the book of Ecclesiastes that those moral boundaries are established by God. When we talk about the sanctity of human life, when we talk about being made in the image of God, wisdom in the book of Ecclesiastes will respond, eternity is in the hearts of men. I love C.S. Lewis when he says, if we find that nothing in this world satisfies, it must be a sign that we are made for another world. That's the idea here. So we have law, we have life. Ecclesiastes will, in wisdom, tell us to enjoy the wife of our youth. We do that under God's blessing, and so that is related to God saying in our original parents' story that it was not good that man be alone, but God would make a helper for him, and Adam would rejoice, this is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, for she was taken out of man. Right? So we have in the basis for wisdom goes back to that original setting in law, in life, in marriage, in work. Remember, Adam is naming the animals, and God is watching, and he is taking pleasure in the way Adam does his work in the garden as he tends it, as he names the animals. And so in Ecclesiastes, one of the things that comes to us as a gift of God is to enjoy the work that God has given us, because this is how we provide for ourselves, and it is the gift of God. And then, of course, we would, in that original creation, day 7 was set aside as a day of rest, so that we could, exactly like Ecclesiastes says, we could remember our Creator, and we could look at what has been accomplished, and we could give him glory. So rest, Ecclesiastes says, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. So, the creation ordinances show up strong as part of the basis for how wisdom will work. So here's my summary from this first talk. There are 2 joys, 2 levels of joy that we as human beings will get from the book of Ecclesiastes. The first one we have to understand needs to be the superlative joy of knowing God. The chief end of man, according to the Westminster Confession, the chief end of man, or the Catechism, the chief end of man is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. See, this book is in a sense a little bit like The Hound of Heaven, that poem that says he lost everything trying to run from God, and then when God catches him and turns him around, God gives him back everything, because now he sees it coming from the hand of God. So the superlative joy that all men need to come to grips with, and then nothing else will matter, is the chief end of man, to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. After that, we have what I'm calling dull sublunary joys, right? Enjoyment in work or marriage or anything else that is good, when it is seen as coming from the hand of God, is good, but it's meaningless when we try to invest all of meaning, all of the purpose in life into that one thing. Nothing, not your work, not your marriage, not fame, not power or influence, none of those things can hold the weight of ultimate and final meaning. Only a relationship with God can do that. After the relationship with God, all those other things are benefits that we can see coming directly from the hand of God as he provides for us. Thanks for hanging out. I look forward to going through the book of Ecclesiastes with you. And so we'll get back together soon.